Welcome back to Interpretations. I'm Owen Gray. This is the third video in a 6-part series interpreting the first chapter of Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. If you haven't seen the first 2 parts, please take a look at the playlist that should be appearing around here. In the first video of the series, I gave a little bit of historical context and set up the genre of this novel as the Bildungsroman, or story of education. In that video, we interpreted the first part of the chapter, which I call the grandfather's curse. So we met the narrator, we learned a little bit about his life and his grandfather's feelings about race in America that are going to haunt and inform the rest of the chapter and the rest of the novel. In the second part, we did a deep dive on the symbolism of the section I call the pre-fight entertainment, when the boys are confronted with a naked white woman who seems to be the embodiment of the white American dream. And we saw the cruelty of the white men unmasked as they began to reveal their true natures. In this video, we are going to tackle the titular battle royal. The black teenagers are going to be pitted against each other by the white racists for their own sick amusement. We're going to look a little bit about class and historical conditions to try and understand what might be motivating the white men in this section. Content warning for this video includes depictions of violence and anti-black racism. With that said, let's get back into the novel. Some were still crying and in hysteria. What a way to start a paragraph. The black teenagers are traumatized by their confrontation with the white men's oppression. But as we tried to leave, we were stopped in order to get into the ring. There was nothing to do but what we were told. Now in this line, we see the power that the white men have. There was nothing to do but what we were told. While it's possible that the black teenagers are physically strong enough to fight their way out of the situation, they know they will have violence visited upon them and their families later if they do not comply. The black teenagers are stripped of their agency and their dignity by the white men. All 10 of us climbed under the ropes and allowed ourselves to be blindfolded with broad bands of white cloth. One of the men seemed to feel a bit sympathetic and tried to cheer us up as we stood with our backs against the ropes. Some of us tried to grin. "See that boy over there?" one of the men said. "I want you to run across at the bell and give it to him right in the belly. If you don't get him, I'm gonna get you. I don't like his looks." Each of us was told the same. The falsely encouraging white man in this scene reminds me of a scene in Richard Wright's memoir, Black Boy. While he was living in Chicago, where we might expect he would experience less racism than he had in Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, though it turns out it's not true, Wright's racist white coworkers tried to instigate a fight between him and another black teenager named Harrison. Eventually, the white men pay Wright and Harrison to fight in a boxing match for their entertainment, much like what the white men are doing here. The memoir Black Boy was published in 1945, so it's possible that Ellison was making a conscious reference to that scene, but it's also possible that these battles royal were common enough that that fact alone would explain their inclusion in both books. I would need to do more research to know which is the case. The blindfolds were put on, yet even then I had been going over my speech. In my mind, each word was as bright as a flame. I felt the cloth pressed into place and frowned so that it would loosen when I relaxed. So, although the narrator has claimed to be seen as a model minority, he shows that he does in fact have some of his grandfather's rebelliousness in him. But now I felt a sudden fit of blind terror. I was unused to darkness. It was as though I had suddenly found myself in a dark room filled with poisonous cottonmouths. Now, I sometimes think that I might be reading too much into it, but these sentences, "I was unused to darkness, it was as though I had suddenly found myself in a dark room filled with poisonous cottonmouths," feel like examples of the narrator feeling closer to white society than he does to black society. I heard the bleary voices yelling insistently for the battle royal to begin. "Get going in there! Let me at that big..." I strained to pick up the school superintendent's voice, as though to squeeze some security out of that slightly more familiar sound. "Let me at those black sons of bitches!" someone yelled. "No, Jackson, no!" another voice yelled. "Here, somebody help me hold Jack!" Here we have the first character to be specifically named in this chapter. He's named Jackson. In this context, thinking about American history and racial history in particular, the name reminds me of Andrew Jackson, who also held humans as slaves and signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that led to the seizure of the lands of Native Americans and the deaths of thousands on the Trail of Tears. "I want to get at that ginger-colored tear him limb from limb," the first voice yelled. I stood against the ropes trembling, for in those days I was what they called ginger-colored, and he sounded as though he might crunch me between his teeth like a crisp ginger cookie. I take this section to mean that the narrator is somewhat light-skinned. I think of a ginger cookie since he references it. This makes me think about colorism, the idea that lighter-skinned black persons are somehow superior to darker-skinned black persons, a type of racial bias that exists today as an additional layer of oppression alongside systemic racism. The fact that he's lighter-skinned also makes me wonder if the narrator has some white ancestors, if the people that enslaved some of his ancestors committed sexual violence against some of the women that they held in slavery. Quite a struggle was going on. Chairs were being kicked about, and I could hear voices grunting as with a terrific effort. I wanted to see more desperately than ever before, but the blindfold was as tight as a thick, skin-puckering scab, and when I raised my gloved hands to push the layers of white aside, a voice yelled, "Oh no you don't, black bastard! Leave that alone!" "Ring the bell before Jackson kills him for someone boomed in the sudden silence. And I heard the bell clang and the sound of feet scuffling forward. A glove smacked against my head. I pivoted, striking out stiffly as someone went past, and felt the jar ripple along the length of my arm to my shoulder. Then it seemed as though all 9 of the boys had turned upon me at once. Blows pounded me from all sides while I struck out as best I could. So many blows landed upon me that I wondered if I were not the only blindfolded fighter in the ring, or if the man called Jackson hadn't succeeded in getting me after all. Now, I've always been intrigued by this line, but never quite been able to make it out. Is the narrator suggesting that the one white man is as powerful as 9 black men? Blindfolded, I could no longer control my motions. I had no dignity. I stumbled about like a baby or a drunken man. The smoke had become thicker, and with each new blow, it seemed to sear and further restrict my lungs. My saliva became like hot, bitter glue. A glove connected with my head, filling my mouth with warm blood. It was everywhere. I could not tell if the moisture I felt upon my body was sweat or blood. A blow landed hard against the nape of my neck. I felt myself going over, my head hitting the floor. Streaks of blue light filled the black world behind the blindfold. I lay prone, pretending that I was knocked out, but felt myself seized by hands and yanked to my feet. "Get going, black boy! Mix it up!" The men calling the narrator Black Boy here again reminds me of Richard Wright's memoir of that name. White men disparaging black men by calling them boy was a common element of the South through Reconstruction and Jim Crow. In fact, I struggled with how to refer to the black teenagers in my commentary. I was tempted to call them boys since I estimated they were probably 16, 17, or 18 because they are, recently graduated from high school, or at least the narrator is. And I wanted to highlight the difference between them and the white men. A friend recommended the word teenager as a way to show that difference in age and power without reproducing racist language. I've also had difficulty picturing parts of the scene. It must be white hands that lifted the narrator up. Was this done by the men in their tuxedos? Is the implication there were other white men acting as referees or waiters or servants that are not otherwise mentioned in the text? Now, we should be careful not to insert things into a text without reference, but again, I've always struggled to picture the racist white men in power lifting the narrator to his feet. My arms were like lead, my head smarting from blows. I managed to feel my way to the ropes and held on, trying to catch my breath. A glove landed in my midsection and I went over again, feeling as though the smoke had become a knife jabbed into my guts. Pushed this way and that by the legs milling around me, I finally pulled erect and discovered that I could see the black, sweat-washed forms weaving in the smoky blue atmosphere like drunken dancers weaving to the rapid drum-like thuds of the blows. This section also has long confused me. Why is he suddenly able to see? Does this go back to him frowning so that the band would be loosened? If so, why wasn't it a help to him earlier in the fight? I've often gotten an almost magical realism sense from the narrator's sudden ability to see, but I don't know if that's supported elsewhere in the text. Everyone fought hysterically. It was complete anarchy. Everybody fought everybody else. No group fought together for long. 2, 3, 4 fought one, then turned to fight each other, were themselves attacked. This section here feels like it's got a layer in which it's also critiquing capitalism's ability to destroy solidarity. It benefits the people in power to keep those over whom they have power fighting each other so that they cannot band together to fight their greater power. Blows landed below the belt and in the kidney, with the gloves open as well as closed, and with my eye partly open now, there was not so much terror. I moved carefully, avoiding blows, although not too many to attract attention, fighting from group to group. The boys groped about like blind, cautious crabs, crouching to protect their midsections, their heads pulled in short against their shoulders, their arms stretched nervously before them, with their fists testing the smoke-filled air like the knobbed feelers of hypersensitive snails. In one corner, I glimpsed a boy violently punching the air and heard him scream in pain as he smashed his hand against a ring post. For a second, I saw him bent over, holding his hand, then going down as a blow caught his unprotected head. I played one group against the other, slipping in and throwing a punch, then stepping out of range while pushing the others into the melee to take the blows blindly aimed at me. This sentence seems to back up the idea that the narrator, looked at as a model black citizen, having internalized some white supremacy, is willing to keep others in a subordinate position to curry favor with the white men in power. He's shown his sense of superiority throughout the chapter, and despite his sense of guilt at being praised by the whites, he earlier said he could not think of any other way to act. So, for me, there's an echo here of the idea of the black field overseer who was said to often be more cruel to other enslaved people than the white overseers were. The smoke was agonizing, and there were no rounds, no bells at 3-minute intervals to relieve our exhaustion. The room spun around me, a swirl of lights, smoke, sweating bodies surrounded by tense white faces. I bled from both nose and mouth, the blood spattering upon my chest. The men kept yelling, "Slug him, black boy! Knock his guts out! Uppercut him! Kill him! Kill that big boy!" Taking a fall, I saw a boy going down heavily beside me as though we were felled by a single blow. Saw a sneaker-clad foot shoot into his groin as the two who had knocked him down stumbled upon him. I rolled out of range, feeling a twinge of nausea. The harder we fought, the more threatening the men became, and yet I had begun to worry about my speech again. How would it go? Would they recognize my ability? What would they give me? And even here, in the middle of the fight, the narrator is very, very concerned about how the white men will view his intelligence. Earlier, he said that he thought that the battle royal might detract from the dignity of his speech, and at the beginning of the fight, he said they had lost their dignity. Now, we have to keep in mind that this whole scene is a memory being recalled or reconstructed 20 years later, and this for me creates a problem of interpretation. How much of this happened as it is described? How much has been changed by the distance the narrator, in his presumably late 30s, is remembering of his late teenage self? Whenever I think about memory, I think about the word remember, which etymologically means to put back together. So, how reliable is the narrator at this point? Also, thinking about how he's said throughout the chapter so far, contradictory and self-contradictory things. So, I want to believe the narrator, but I also don't know how much I can trust him, and that creates an interesting tension for me as I'm reading. Was he really so keen on his speech throughout this whole event? And so that's the end of part 3, the Battle Royal. Thank you so much for watching. Join me next week when I tackle part 4, the title match. If you liked this video, please give it a like. If you didn't like it, well, give it a dislike. I look forward to joining you for conversation in the comments below. If you liked this video, please share it on social media if you think someone else would get something out of it, and subscribe and the other YouTube things. If you like the work that I am doing, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/owenxgrey. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/owenxgrey and on facebook.com at facebook.com/owenxgrey. Thank you again for watching, and until next time, keep interpreting.